And now, a passage from The First American Imperialist by William S. Rossiter. The present colonial policy of the United States did not originate in the conditions growing out of the war with Spain. It was advocated 52 years ago by a Commodore of the United States Navy who wrote of his purposes and impressions to the Navy Department from the old side-wheeler Susquehanna cruising in 1853 in the Japan Sea. This man was Matthew C. Perry, a product of the early Navy, trained in the school of Bainbridge, Hull, and Decatur, brother of Perry of the Lakes, and his superior in most matters of administration and judgment. The treaty which resulted from the American expedition to Japan commanded by Commodore Perry was signed at Kanagawa, beside the Bay of Yedo, March 31st, 1854. This historic document terminated the Japanese policy of seclusion which had been strictly enforced for 2 centuries and marked the beginning of intercourse and trade with the United States, and subsequently with other foreign nations. The immediate occasion for the American expedition was the barbarous treatment experienced by American sailors wrecked on the coasts of Japan. In the treacherous waters of the Indian Ocean and the China and Japan seas, shipwrecks were frequent. Prior to the negotiation of the treaty, foreigners had been so rigidly excluded that ships of other nations, even when in distress, were not permitted to enter Japanese ports, and shipwrecked seamen had been subjected to the most cruel treatment. Even Japanese sailors driven to sea in the frail junks employed in coastwise traffic and picked up by foreign vessels or cast upon foreign shores were not permitted to return to their native land if brought in foreign ships. Had the expedition to Japan been an ordinary event in naval history, satisfaction over the successful outcome of it would have died out long ago. The contrary has occurred. Each turn in the rapid movement of affairs in the Orient and our own entry within a decade into the company of ruling powers across the Pacific have emphasized the importance of the expedition, the influence of which still lingers in the cordial relations existing between the United States and the Japanese Empire. After the beginning of the 19th century, Japan's policy of seclusion, which had been enforced since 1638, became increasingly impracticable. Western nations were beginning to compete actively for Eastern trade, and the large population and reputed wealth of this hermit nation offered great temptations to mercantile enterprise. The Portuguese, who had been the first to secure a foothold in the islands in 1542, and to whose religious activity the Japanese policy of exclusion was principally due, repeatedly attempted to reestablish commercial relations. The French, Dutch, Spanish, English, Russians, and Americans successively endeavored to trade or negotiate treaties but failed, although the Dutch were allowed to send a trading ship annually to Nagasaki and to keep under humiliating conditions a resident commissioner at that point. As the century advanced, the Japanese indeed showed a tendency to enforce exclusion even more strictly. They observed closely the course of events in the East and perceived that England was gaining a foothold on the mainland at Shanghai and Hong Kong, and elsewhere in the Orient. They feared that a similar policy would be attempted in connection with their own country. The early visits of Americans to Japan were unofficial and commercial, but prior to the expedition commanded by Commodore Perry, the federal government had made 3 attempts to open communication with Japanese authorities. In 1832, a commercial agent, Mr. Roberts, was appointed, but unfortunately he died before reaching the islands. In 1846, Commodore Biddle, acting under the instructions of the Navy Department, visited Uraga with the ship of the line Columbus and the sloop Vincennes, but was unable to secure any concessions. And in 1848, Commander Glynn entered the harbor of Nagasaki in order to rescue 15 seamen wrecked from the whaling ship Ladoga. He forced respect for the American flag and the release of the seamen by threatening to fire upon the city unless his demands were complied with. By the middle of the century, Japan's policy of exclusion had become of greater importance to the United States than to any other nation. It involved far more than mere commercial extension. The sperm whale had been nearly exterminated in the North Atlantic, but it was still abundant in the North Pacific, and the base of the whale hunting industry was being shifted to the Pacific coast. Many incidental but important changes resulted from this transfer. In 1845, when whaling had reached its greatest prosperity, more than $15 million of American capital were invested in this industry in the Far East. At least 10,000 men were employed in connection with it. The Japanese themselves state that in 1 year, shortly before the arrival of Commodore Perry, nearly 100 American whalers passed Matsume. This transfer of the whaling industry to the Orient necessitated relations with Japan. In 1846, 2 whaling ships were wrecked on the island of Nippon. Their crews were captured and treated with great barbarity, their lives being spared only through the intercession of the Dutch commissioner. So serious did this matter become that in discussing the attitude of Japan, the American Secretary of State declared that the Japanese were derelict in those responsibilities which devolve upon every independent nation. And he laid down the rule that if a nation habitually and systematically disregarded the plain requirements of civilization in the treatment of unfortunate persons cast on their shores by stress of weather, as if they were the most atrocious criminals, such a nation must be regarded as the common enemy of mankind. Moreover, if permitted to remain undisturbed, conditions were liable to grow worse rather than better for the navigation of the ocean by steam, the acquisition and rapid settlement by the United States of the vast territory on the Pacific, and the rapid communication established across the isthmus had brought the United States into much closer proximity to the East than ever before. And although the consequences of these events had scarcely begun to be felt, intercourse had already greatly increased. Thus, by 1851, the necessity of protecting American citizens navigating the China and Japan seas had become urgent. In that year, the bark Auckland picked up at sea a number of Japanese waifs and carried them to San Francisco. Learning of this event, Commodore Aulick interested the Secretary of State in a plan for opening communication with Japan. And Mr. Webster addressed an official note to Mr. Graham, the Secretary of the Navy, suggesting that the incident offered an opportunity for opening commercial relations with Japan, or at least for securing some relief from the unfavorable conditions then prevailing. Meanwhile, affairs within the Japanese Empire were also approaching a crisis. The anomalous dual government of Mikado and Shogun was soon to cease, and conditions were ripe for a complete change of policy. Commodore Perry, therefore, anchored off Uraga at a moment favorable to the success of his mission. So successful indeed was the expedition that it does not appear that any inquisitive historian has ever raised the question as to what would have happened had diplomacy failed. For just such a contingency, however, the methodical and far-sighted Perry was fully prepared. In case of failure, Commodore Perry planned to seize a conveniently located island and to hold it in the name of the United States until ordered to let go, to create a harbor of refuge for Americans stranded in that distant region, and to found a center of influence for American trade in order to counteract the colonizing and commercial invasion of the East by Great Britain. Incidentally, he expected to bring good government and prosperity to the natives. Half a century later, the policy which Commodore Perry outlined was to be known in the controversies of American politics as imperialism. In the light of this interesting fact, the official correspondence between Perry and the Navy Department, which may be found in the neglected pages of a volume of Miscellaneous Documents of Congress, 1855, assumes an importance quite apart from its historical character. Of all persons in the service of the government at that time, Commodore Perry was probably best fitted to succeed in the delicate task upon which he was dispatched and to form an intelligent forecast of future conditions in the East. He was the product of the early Navy, having become a midshipman in 1809 at the age of 13, and he was only 17 when, under Rogers in the frigate President, he chased and fought the British in the Second War with England. At 18, he was a lieutenant, and at 25, the commander of a 12-gun schooner. The years that followed these early and stirring experiences ripened the knowledge thus gained. He made cruises in the now long-forgotten line of battle ships and frigates such as the North Carolina and Brandywine, manned by men of Nantucket and Cape Cod. He saw honorable and most important service in the Mexican War, and by study and patient experiment in adapting steam to successful use in war vessels, he won the title of Father of the Steam Navy. When Perry received his last and most important assignment, the Japan expedition, he had completed 40 years of active service and achievement. Throughout his long service, whether chasing slavers, stamping out scurvy, improving the morals and discipline of his crew, or commanding a fleet, he accomplished his task with conspicuous fidelity and attention to detail. The instructions of the Navy Department to Commodore Perry enclosed a communication from the State Department. The objects sought by this government, wrote Mr. Conrad, acting Secretary of State, to Mr. Kennedy, the Secretary of the Navy, are these. 1. To effect some permanent arrangement with Japan for the protection of American seamen and property wrecked on these islands or driven into their ports by stress of weather. 2. The permission to American vessels to enter one or more of their ports in order to obtain supplies of provisions, water, fuel, etc., or, in case of disasters, to refit, so as to enable them to prosecute their voyage. 3. The permission to our vessels to enter one or more of their ports for the purpose of disposing of their cargoes by sale or barter. This government, however, does not seek by this expedition to obtain any exclusive commercial advantage for itself, but on the contrary, desires and expects that whatever benefit may result from it will ultimately be shared by the civilized world, as there can be no doubt that if the ports of the country are once opened to one nation, they would soon be opened to all. If, after having exhausted every argument and every means of persuasion, the Commodore should fail to obtain from the Japanese government any relaxation of their system of exclusion, or even any assurance of humane treatment of our shipwrecked seamen, he will then change his tone and inform them in the most unequivocal terms that it is the determination of this government to insist that hereafter all citizens or vessels of the United States that may be wrecked on their coasts or driven by stress of weather into their harbors shall, so long as they are compelled to remain there, be treated with humanity, and that if any acts of cruelty should hereafter be practiced upon citizens of this country, whether by the government or by the inhabitants of Japan, they will be severely chastised. It is impossible by any instructions, however minute, to provide for every contingency that may arise in the prosecution of a mission of so peculiar and novel a character. For this reason, as well as on account of the remoteness of the scene of his operation, it is proper that the Commodore should be invested with large discretionary powers and should feel assured that any departure from usage or any error of judgment he may commit will be viewed with indulgence.